Hello everyone, and welcome to the lab on the special sensory organs, anatomy, and dissection of the eye. Vision is our dominant sense. In fact, nearly 70% of all the sensory receptors in the body are in the eyes. As you know, our ability to see is controlled by these receptors, which communicate with the central nervous system via the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve. When you look in the mirror, only a small part of the anterior section of the eye is visible. The remainder is enclosed by the eye socket or orbit, where it's protected not only by the bones surrounding it, but also by a protective fatty capsule which encases and cushions it. This protection is extremely important because, as you'll see, the eye is a complex, delicate structure, and even the slightest damage can permanently affect your vision. The eyeball itself is a small, hollow, spherical structure with a diameter of only about an inch. Filling the interior compartment of the eye is a watery, gelatinous fluid called the vitreous humor, and this fluid is important because it helps to maintain the overall shape of the eyeball. The wall of the eye is composed of three distinct layers of tissue: the fibrous layer, the vascular layer, and the sensory layer. The fibrous layer, which is composed of avascular connective tissue, is the outermost layer of the eyeball, and it has two distinct parts. The sclera is the white of the eye. It's a relatively tough tissue which serves as the attachment point for the muscles that control eyeball movements. Continuous with the sclera anteriorly is the cornea. The cornea is transparent and it forms a window through which light enters the eye. As the most anterior part of the eye, it's also the most exposed part of the eye, which makes it particularly susceptible to damage. For example, if you wear contacts and you don't clean them well enough, bits of dirt and other debris on the contact can rub against your cornea and scratch it. Despite being easily damaged, however, the cornea has an extraordinary regenerative ability, so in other words, the body can easily repair it. Also, an interesting fact about the cornea is that it's the only tissue in the human body that can be transplanted from one person to another with little or no possibility of tissue rejection. To get a better idea of what the sclera and cornea look like, we can take a look at a dissected eye. Notice that this eye has been cut in half by making a sagittal incision. Here you can see that the sclera continues around the entire surface of the eyeball, and again the cornea is the anteriormost section continuous with the sclera. Notice here that the cornea appears opaque, not transparent. This change in the cornea occurs after death. Consequently, for a successful cornea transplant, this tissue must be harvested before this change occurs. The second layer of the eye, which contains the eye's pigmented structures, is the vascular layer, also called the uvea. The uvea has three distinct regions: the choroid, ciliary body, and iris. The choroid is a dark brown membrane that forms the posteriormost portion of the uvea. Its brown pigment absorbs light entering the eye, preventing it from scattering and reflecting inside the eye. This is important because it allows the light that enters your eye to be focused on the sensory receptors at the back of the eye, and without it we wouldn't be able to make much sense of the visual input we receive. Anterior to and continuous with the choroid is the ciliary body, a ring of tissue that encircles the lens. This tissue contains smooth muscles that control the shape of the lens, allowing light to be properly focused within the eye. Sandwiched between the cornea and lens is the third portion of the vascular layer, the iris. The iris, which is the anteriormost part of the vascular layer, is the colored part of the eye we see when looking in the mirror. The color of the iris is controlled by genetic factors and depends on the degree of pigment production in the cells of the iris. Located in the center of the iris is an opening called the pupil, which allows light to enter the eye. Depending on the amount of light available, the diameter of the pupil changes as smooth muscles in the iris contract, regulating the amount of light that enters the eye. The innermost layer of the eye is called the sensory layer. It's composed of a delicate two-layered membrane called the retina. The outer portion of the retina is the pigmented layer. This layer is composed of epithelial cells that function similarly to the choroid in that they absorb light as it enters the eye to prevent it from scattering and allowing our eyes to form a focused image. These cells are also capable of phagocytosis of old damaged photoreceptors and in addition, these cells store vitamin A, which is needed for proper functioning of photoreceptors. Remember that vitamin A comes from foods rich in beta-carotene, like carrots, and other foods with bright orange and red pigments. The inner layer of the retina, the neural layer, is the only part of the eye directly involved in vision. It contains 3 types of neurons, including photoreceptors, bipolar cells, and ganglion cells. The photoreceptors include rods and cones. Rods are receptors for light entering the eye, whereas cones, which are concentrated in the eye's focal point, detect colors. To ensure that light is properly focused on the photoreceptors in the eye, the lens, a biconcave disc posterior to the retina, directs light to the eye's focal point as it enters through it. By changing shape, the lens allows for precise focusing, allowing us to see clearly. Sometimes, however, the eyeball may be slightly misshapen, which affects the ability of the lens to focus light properly. If this is the case, connective lenses can be worn to ensure that your eye's lens does its job correctly, and the shape of the corrective lens is dependent on whether you're nearsighted or farsighted. Now that you're familiar with the basic anatomy of the human eye, take a moment to look at the figure of the dissected cow eye. Hopefully you can see how complex this structure really is. In particular, notice the delicate tissue of the retina. The green arrow here indicates a region of the retina called the optic disc. This is the point where the neurons of the retina converge, forming the optic nerve which exits the back of the eye. That concludes this podcast on sensory organs, anatomy of the eye. At this point, you should follow the posted instructions for completing this week's assignment.